Good morning and welcome to the NABERS Renewable Energy Indicator Customer Preview. Today's session is split into three parts. To kick things off, we have a welcome address by the Director of NABERS, Carlos Flores. We'll then have Monique Alfres, the NABERS Head of Market Transformation, talk about the Renewable Energy Indicator and what it means for you as NABERS customers. And finally, Carlos will be leading a panel session with three industry representatives who will weigh in on the impacts of the Renewable Energy Indicator on the property industry. We'll also have time for Q&A for Monique and the panel members. So if you have any questions, you can submit them by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Before we kick things off, I first want to acknowledge that today we meet on many different Aboriginal lands, and we at NABERS pay our respects to the elders of these lands, past, present, and emerging. NABERS also extends that respect to any Aboriginal person attending this session. I myself am coming to you from Darwell country in the Illawarra region of New South Wales, and I want to personally pay respects to the traditional custodians of this land. And now I'll hand you over to the Director of NABERS, Carlos Flores.
Thank you so much, Andy, and welcome everybody to today's session. Thank you for joining us for the preview of the Renewable Energy Indicator for building owners, tenants, and organizations who are the end users of NABERS ratings. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands in which we meet today. I am today in the land of the Darug people here in Parramatta in Sydney. And we have a jam-packed agenda with quite a bit in the next hour and a half for you. We will be giving you a preview of the upcoming Renewable Energy Indicator, which we will be launching in the next month, on the 6th of June, so just under a month. My colleague Monique Alfres, our Head of Market Transformation at NABERS, will be joining us soon to take a deep dive into what the Renewable Energy Indicator, how it came to be, how we work with industry to develop it, and what it actually looks like in practice. And later in the session, we also have a really exciting discussion with three industry partners and also real leaders in the sustainability space here in Australia. We'll have Luke Mansell, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council. We'll have Frankie Muscovich, the National Policy Director of the Property Council of Australia, who's also the co-chair of the NABERS Steering Committee, and also David Palin, who is the National ESG Manager at Mirvac. So they're going to talk us through some of the big shifts we are seeing in the building decarbonisation space and how tools like the Renewable Energy Indicator can really help us address some of those challenges. Now, we have a lot to talk about today. We'll have opportunities to answer a lot of your questions as well. So please drop your questions at any point. We're going to have two different Q&A sessions today. So our goal is to have no question unanswered. So if you have questions, please drop them in. We strongly encourage that as we go along. Now, I do want to do a snapshot of as you know, NABERS has been running for 25 years at this point. It's the longest running building sustainability initiative in Australia. We're turning 25 years. And in the past 5 or 6 years, we've been taking a lot of actions to really adapt NABERS so we can make a bigger difference in helping Australia decarbonize. And I want to start with my first slide on this, just to show you some of these actions that we have been taking us to where we are today. What you should be looking on the screen now, and I can see it, is one of our efforts has been about expanding NABERS to new sectors. And the reason we've been doing that is because up until 2015, 2016, we could only work with 4 subsectors of the built environment. And obviously, buildings are much, much bigger than just those 4 subsectors. So we have been working with industry and with our colleagues in government, and in particular with the Commonwealth Government, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water, who have actually helped us fund a significant expansion of NABERS that is still ongoing to more and more sectors. And that is really what you've seen on the screen. In the last few years, we've expanded to the high-density residential buildings with apartment buildings, public hospitals, which is one of the biggest energy and emissions users in government, residential aged care and retirement living, and about 1.5 years ago, warehouses and cold store only 6 months ago. So that is the latest release of a NABERS tool. And we're currently already working on developing a tool for public and private schools, as well as a lot of retail that works outside of shopping centers. So the big box retail, a lot of retail that you enter through, street level, and also many of the tenants that are actually host inside of a shopping center that up until recently we didn't have a rating for. We're actually working to expand to that. So this expansion has really helped us cover a lot more sectors and work with a lot more people than we could in the past. We also were in 2017, 2018, we were one of the leading co-authors of the climate active carbon neutral certification along our partners in the GBCA, who we do a lot of our projects these days are in close partnership with our colleagues in the Green Building Council. And the combination of expanding our ratings and also helping create rating tools like climate active carbon neutral means that we've been, amplify our ability to work with more of the building sector. And we also been looking at, what is it that we need to do beyond covering and working with more organizations to help the Australian building sector to decarbonize. So that's our focus in the last couple of years has been not just on going, wider and working with more stakeholders, but also going deeper. What are things that we need to do and buildings need to do to decarbonize? And what you're looking at on the next slide is basically 3 actions that are on a really broad basis that are recommended by pretty much any major piece of research or policy recommendations you see, from the International Energy Agency to organizations like Climate Works here in Australia, and a lot of industry bodies that have released their own advocacy platforms in the last couple of years. And they come into these 3 broad categories. The first one is we need to continue to make our buildings more efficient and reduce energy consumption. And that's partly because that saves emissions in the short term, but also actually helps declutter the electricity grid, if you will, creating capacity in the electricity system for the electrification steps that we're taking with, electrifying heating and also bringing electric vehicles into our cities. So it helps counter that and the trend that we're going to see of increased electricity consumption in the long term. So that's really important. Pretty much everybody recommends strong action in that space. We actually saw very strong action announced by the Commonwealth government in that space in the budget announcements just recently. The second part is about eliminating on-site fossil fuels, which is a core part of what we will talk about today. Every major piece of research has shown that that is a very, very significant challenge in the building sector. We'll dive deeper into what that looks like for buildings today. But this is unlike the changes to the electricity system, which can be done on the supply side of the energy system in generation and transmission and distribution. The challenge of eliminating fossil fuels on site is mostly about electrifying buildings, which means taking action locally, building by building, across hundreds of thousands of buildings, and in the case of residential, across millions of residential dwellings. So quite a significant challenge there. And also, once you electrify and use all your energy sources from electricity, purchasing 100% renewable energy is another really important action that is strongly recommended, because it actually helps drive investment to the energy supply system and actually create more generation more quickly. We'll dive into all of those a little bit later, but let's just look first into the kind of areas that NABERS has historically tackled, which is reducing energy use. We've been doing that for 20 years. And I just wanted to show you quickly, what that looks like in how we're doing in that space. What this graph is showing is one sector, so it's not the entirety of the building sector, is the office market, the area where NABERS has the longest running tool. It's been running for 25 years here in Australia. And this line shows we take the first time a building gets a NABERS rating, and then we see, well, what happens when they come back a year later? Are those buildings using less energy consumption the next year? And the answer is yes. We see the average building of 2,500 offices, pretty much the entire office sector. The average building uses about 3% less energy after 1 year after joining NABERS, and then 5% after 2 years of joining NABERS. And then it keeps going down all the way to about 33% or so after 10 years, and it continues to reduce. So we've seen this line is pretty much every office building you have ever seen. And it's a very, very fast rate of energy consumption reduction. We've actually seen something very similar in shopping centers as well. It kind of shows you that these energy savings are possible to obtain. We have sort of found a template of how we can do it. It's a combination of having rating tools like NABERS, having policies that use government procurement, that use disclosure, that use sustainable finance to create more drivers for a lot of owners to want and be able to benefit from having more energy efficient buildings. And so this is by no means job done. We have a lot of work to do. And in a lot of other sectors of the built environment, we have not seen this change just yet. So this is these energy savings are possible, but we haven't achieved them yet. Now, that is on the energy efficiency front. So a lot of work to do, but we have some things that are working very, very well. and arguably better than in any other country in the world, these curves are actually mostly unseen in most developed economies. But I want to focus a little bit on electrification. And historically, as a program, we haven't really done it's not one of the things that NABERS has been encouraging. And on my next slide, I wanted to show you a little bit of the scale of the challenge in electrification before we dive deeper later on this session. This graph is coming from great research done by ASPEC very recently, is rapid and least cost decarbonization pathways for buildings, and basically shedding light on that most of the subsectors of the building sector, this is every building sector that is non-residential, so the other half of the energy sector, the building sector, and gas consumption is actually found in a lot of those buildings and in many buildings in the non-residential world. Some of the sectors that use the most gas are the sectors where NABERS is already in, which is offices, retail, and hotels. And on my next slide, I want to show you what this looks like at the building by building level on the data that we are seeing. So we see, obviously, the challenge of electrifying is different in different sectors. Some sectors will use more gas than others, but we do see gas consumption in fossil fuels on site present in a lot of buildings. And obviously some of them, like hospitals, hotels, retirement living, aged care, apartment buildings, a lot of buildings where people actually stay overnight, is we see a really, really big energy consumption there, but also very significant uses of gas and fossil fuels on the more traditional commercial property space, if you will, like offices, shopping centers, and retail and others. I think it's really important to reflect on this because 3 or 4 years ago, we were not having many conversations about electrification. Today, we are. Conversations about electrification are everywhere, which is really great to see, but also is important to distinguish between a lot of conversations versus actually being on a path to really addressing this challenge. Most buildings in NABERS that we've seen in the last few years are still using fossil fuels. Most of existing buildings haven't electrified just yet. And even in new buildings, we're still seeing some buildings, or a significant proportion of buildings, coming online and still using fossil fuels, even though they could have been designed to be all electric from the start. So a very big challenge. We're going to be working on this together collectively for, I suspect, the better part of the next decade or two. But it's really important that we get going and understand how big this challenge is and how all of us in this call have a really big role to play there. Now, on my next slide, I wanted to highlight that industry has really been leading in this space. There's been lots of work, especially in the last 12 months, of really big major industry bodies representing a lot of major players in the built environment calling for more action on electrification. The latest example of this is Every Building Counts, which was launched only a couple of weeks ago by the Property Council and the Green Building Council. And electrification has been basically upgraded to one of the core areas where industry is calling governments, like in organizations like NABERS, to take more action. Now, on my next and final slide, I did wanted to talk a little bit about the things that NABERS is doing to address this before we dive into the Renewable Energy Indicator, which Monique will run us through. The first one is that we have made one change to NABERS already, which is we are recognizing that the grid is decarbonizing. The buildings using more electricity every year, they're actually getting lower and lower in carbon, and they're becoming, lower in carbon compared to buildings that are using a lot of fossil fuels. We made a change in 2021, recognizing that. We're going to continue to change NABERS star ratings every 5 years. So we recognize the efforts of those who are removing fossil fuels and who are electrifying and getting lower emissions as a result. A lot of you in this call may have known that already, but if you don't, I think it's really important that you know that if you electrify, you will see an improvement in your NABERS rating, and that will be stronger and stronger over the coming years. We have another change scheduled for 2025, and that change is going to be even bigger because the grid has been decarbonizing so rapidly in the last couple of years. So that is one way in which we're looking into continue to recognize the efforts of people putting the hard yards to electrify their buildings. And I think the second one is the Renewable Energy Indicator, which is a combination of it does basically two things at a high level. It provides a really clean disclosure of how much non-renewable energy you have in your building, and that is both fossil fuels used on site and also electricity from non-renewable sources as well. So it's disclosing that and also recognizing the efforts of those who are both electrifying and purchasing renewable energy electricity. and they're moving their buildings towards being closer and closer to be efficient buildings run on 100% renewable energy, which is what the Renewable Energy Indicator is all about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Monique Alfres. She is the head of market transformation here at NABERS. And she's going to tell us all about what the Renewable Energy Indicator is, how it came to be, how we work with industry on making it happen, and what it actually looks like in practice. Thank you, Monique.
Hi, everyone. Morning. As Carlos mentioned, I'm going to be taking you through some of the details of the Renewable Energy Indicator, how we got here, how it works, how to find out what your score is going to be, how you can prepare and what you can do to improve. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit of history about how we got here. It's not something that happened overnight. We've all been working on this for years. Many people that are on the call have participated in many workshops and processes and consultation papers to get us to where we are today. So I thought I'd take you back to the very beginning and just take you through all the steps of what we've worked on over those years together and how each component of the Renewable Energy Indicator has come together over time. So way back in 2019, the Renewable Energy Indicator was a bit of a sparkle in a few stakeholders' eyes. NABERS was considering the impact of increasing renewables in the grid on ratings, and industry at this time started advocating for the adoption of market-based carbon accounting, which is an international standard for how we can account for purchases of renewable energy. Later that year, we had our first technical working group, and many of you on the line were in that meeting where we met in person down near Central Station. And again, stakeholders raised that it was very important that we begin to align NABERS with market-based carbon accounting. So in March 2020, that was when the National Steering Committee, which oversees the operations of NABERS, first approved that we do actually adopt market-based carbon accounting within the NABERS framework. How we would do that, we would come to over time, but that was the first point where the National Steering Committee said, yes, we agree, this is something that NABERS should do. So in May 2020, we released our first consultation paper. In that paper, we were looking at the underlying emissions factors and different calculation methods. And in the majority of respondents to that paper were very positive, including all the peak bodies saying that, yes, this is something we should go ahead with. From June to September 2020, the National Steering Committee went through a series of workshops to carefully consider a number of different elements within the Renewable Energy Indicator. We specifically together looked at how we would recognise the renewable energy target, what we would do about non-green power LGCs, and importantly, we looked carefully at how we should recognise on-site solar in NABERS. So that's something that we get a lot of questions about, and I am going to go through that in a lot of detail, but I do just want to let you know that this is something that has been considered in a significant amount of detail. We then thought that we would be able to modify the NABERS with Green Power product to allow it to take into account market-based carbon accounting. And we put forward a number of different options to stakeholders. But in December 2020, stakeholders came back to us and were very strong in saying that the modifications to NABERS Energy with Green Power were not adequate and that we needed to look at alternative options for recognising the purchase of renewable energy and all electric buildings within NABERS. So at that point, the National Steering Committee approved the change in direction. So if we go on to the next slide, between March and September 2021, the National Steering Committee was presented with a proposal to redesign NABERS Energy with Green Power, and the Renewable Energy Indicator began to be tested with stakeholders. We released a second consultation paper later in 2021, which looked at how we would recognise renewable energy and all electric buildings. And again, the majority of respondents, including all the peak bodies, agreed with what was put forward in that consultation paper. So the proposal to retire NABERS Energy with Green Power and adopt the Renewable Energy Indicator was approved early in 2022, and a public announcement was made. Since then, we did a bunch of pilots, which was really exciting. We worked with a lot of you to actually get projects to go through the Renewable Energy Indicator, test out the rules, see what their results would be at the end. And since the middle of last year, we've been working on rules development and refinement. We've actually released versions of the rules so you can see online. We've released a calculator where you can estimate what your score would be. And we've been doing online platform testing and development, which brings us to where we are today. So if we go to the next slide, what is the Renewable Energy Indicator? The renewable energy indicator is going to show us the proportion of energy that's either generated on site or procured from off-site renewable energy during the rating period. It's very simply the amount of renewable energy that is generated on site or procured by the building divided by the total amount of energy that is within the rating scope for your NABERS rating. To compare to NABERS Energy, NABERS Energy measures the energy efficiency of the building using greenhouse gas emissions factors to provide a comparison between electricity and gas. The renewable energy indicator is going to provide a transparent display of energy purchased by the building and considers electricity and gas equally. It doesn't use an algorithm to come up with a star rating. It's just a straight percentage, one number divided by another. Only buildings that are all electric and procure 100% of their energy from renewable sources are going to be able to score 100% on our renewable energy indicator. So if you go to the next slide, what is it that the renewable energy indicator is going to do? Well, it's going to reward all electric buildings which procure 100% renewable energy. It's going to recognise renewable energy contributions, both from government targets and purchases that are outside of green power. So that means that if you're lucky enough to live in the ACT and you have the government retiring LGCs on your behalf, those are going to be recognised. And finally, as was mentioned in the timeline a number of times, something that's really important to stakeholders is alignment. So it's going to align NABERS with local and international standards on market-based carbon accounting. So if we go to the next slide, what is it going to look like? Well, we've redesigned the certificate. So after the launch, you'll all be getting these new certificates whenever you do a NABERS energy rating. You can see the NABERS energy rating is at the top. And it's important to say that as part of the launch of the renewable energy indicator, there is going to be no change to NABERS energy ratings. So everything that we're talking about today is about the renewable energy indicator. There's no change to the way that NABERS energy ratings are going to be calculated, and that will still continue to be on your certificate as it is today. The renewable energy indicator is going to be underneath the NABERS energy rating and will show the percentage of source of energy in the building. It's going to be provided with each rating across all sectors that have a NABERS energy rating at no additional charge. So every single NABERS energy rating that is done after the launch date will get a renewable energy indicator. If you can't get your information for the renewable energy indicator in time for certification, you can still get your NABERS energy rating. It's just that you'll get a basic renewable energy indicator that only includes the government targets, such as the renewable energy target. You can then improve this for future ratings by providing the information that's required for your renewable energy indicator. So it shouldn't hold you up for any of your BEAC assessments or CBD assessments or anything like that, because the questions for the renewable energy indicator are optional. It's just that you'll get a lower score, which you can then look to improve in future ratings. And you don't need to pay anything extra for it either. I should add that too. So what is considered renewable energy? Like we've been discussing in the last couple of slides, it includes the renewable energy target, which is the renewable energy that we all pay for on every electricity bill that we get, and also any jurisdictional renewable energy purchasing, like what is happening in the ACT. It considers on-site renewable energy generation, which I mentioned is a little bit complex. So we're going to go into it in more detail on the next slide. And then finally, renewable energy purchases where LGCs are retired on behalf of the building being rated. So if we go on to the next slide, on-site renewable energy. This is definitely the area where we get the most questions. So hopefully after this slide today, you'll have a little bit more insight into how it works and why. It's certainly one of the more complex areas between the interaction between NABERS Energy and the NABERS Energy Indicator. So firstly, on-site renewable energy will continue to improve your NABERS energy rating in exactly the same way that it does today. There's not going to be any change to the way on-site renewable energy is treated. So long as it's used on-site, regardless of metering or LGC status, it's going to improve your NABERS energy rating. The reason for this is that industry considered it to be an on-site energy efficiency initiative, and this was something that was consulted on widely with both the National Steering Committee and industry. So it is remaining as it currently is within the NABERS energy rating. On-site renewable energy is also going to improve your renewable energy indicator. Where it is metered, used by the building, and if you're lucky enough that you've got an on-site system that's large enough to create LGCs, if you create those LGCs, that they are retired against the building. So if the system's very small and it doesn't create LGCs, it just needs to be metered and used by the building. But if you do happen to create LGCs, which is your decision as owner of the on-site generator, they need to be retired against the building being rated. On-site renewable energy is also going to improve your renewable energy indicator where the energy is exported. LGCs are created and they are retired against the building. So if the energy is exported and you have LGCs that are created, it's going to be treated like any other offsite renewable energy purchase. Unfortunately, if you have a small system and you export energy and you are unable to create LGCs, you won't be able to count it towards the renewable energy indicator. And that's because of the way that carbon accounting works. And I'm happy to go into more detail on that with anybody after the call if they'd like to get into the details and specifics of that. So where does on-site renewable energy not contribute to your renewable energy indicator? It doesn't contribute where the system is unmetered, and so we don't know how much energy has been created, where it's exported without LGC creation, or where LGCs are sold to others. So leave it on the screen for a moment. You might want to take a bit of a screenshot, but also happy to go through this in detail with anyone that would like to have a better understanding of it, or perhaps send us their specific situation after the webinar. I want you to know that this approach aligns with local and international standards for market-based carbon accounting and has been endorsed by industry through consultation and also with our National Steering Committee. All right, let's get on to the exciting bit. How do I find out what score my building's going to get? Well, we've developed a calculator for that. You can go to the rating tool section of our website, click on estimate your rating, and we've got a calculator that you can download. You can take the information from your last NABERS rating and enter it, or if you've got the information from this year, you can enter it into the calculator and it will tell you what your score is going to be. What do you need to do to prepare? So the first thing that you should do to prepare is go and talk to your assessor and read the rules. The rules are extremely detailed and all of our assessors have now gone through mandatory training. So they should be able to answer any basic questions that you might have on how it's all going to work and what you need to do to prepare. One thing that you might want to have a look at is metering for your on-site solar systems. A lot of on-site solar systems aren't metered. We do have some options for how you can be able to get that information about your on-site system, which are contained in the rules, which are a little bit more relaxed than the metering requirements for the rest of NABERS ratings, because we know that we do have a lot of systems out there that don't necessarily have that metering in place. And the final bit is to gather proof of your renewable energy purchasing. So if we go to the next slide, one question that I get quite a lot from building owners is, what if I have an unusual retirement method for my LGCs? And what if my retirements aren't done in time for certification? So I just want to let you know, you're not alone. We've seen all colours of the rainbow in terms of how LGCs are being retired and how those retirements are being allocated towards certain buildings. So the first thing to do, again, would be to go and talk to your assessor and review our rules. All of the colours of the rainbow that we've seen so far, we've captured within our rules. So hopefully there is a method in there for you. Everything that we've heard of where we are able to accept that method, we have included in there. Having said that, we have no expectation that we're going to have all of the methods from day one. So if you do have a method that you're using that you think should be recognised, just get in touch with us and we're going to work together, especially in that critical first year after launching the indicator, to make sure that we've got all of the different ways that you can do this lined up and in our rules and as a way to be recognised. Someone asked me yesterday, if you go through level 2 audit, and let's say your retirements aren't done in time for certification, does that mean that through the level 2 audit process, your renewable energy indicator is going to change? Now, there is a method in the rules that allows you to have a contract in place to retire those LGCs. So you might be doing it quarterly, for example, and your rating period sort of falls awkwardly within that quarterly period. So long as you have that contract in place and you can show that those retirements are being done regularly, that will be fine. Have a look in the rules to see the exact details. If the level 2 audit falls after you should have done the retirement and you haven't done the retirement yet, that's something that we'll work through in the level 2 audit process with you. But if it falls before that, then you'll be in line with the rules, so you shouldn't have any concerns. So like I said, take a look at the rules, see if it aligns with the way that you're doing it at the moment, and please come and talk to us, because like I said, you know, for the first year, we're expecting that we're going to be working very closely with industry, and that there will be other methods that we will come across that we will allow and add to future updates of the rules. So if we go to the last slide, finally, NABERS Energy with green power ratings, what's going to happen with them? Well, after the launch, NABERS Energy without green power ratings are going to continue, but NABERS Energy ratings with green power is going to be phased out, because that product is now being replaced with the Renewable Energy Indicator at the request of industry. If you go to the next slide, we do know that there are a lot of buildings out there that are using green power to improve their ratings and comply with lease requirements from tenants, particularly with government tenants. So we are going to provide a 2-year transition period. After we launch the Renewable Energy Indicator, we're going to continue to provide the NABERS Energy with green power results in the rating report for a 2-year period. And you can see a little screenshot that I've provided there, which shows you what that number is, so that you can use that to comply with any lease requirements you might have. This result is not going to be shown on the certificate anymore. It's only going to be shown on the report. And after the 2-year period, we're no longer going to be calculating the green power results, and we're no longer going to be including it in the report. So what you need to look at with those leases is how you're going to transition away from that requirement over the next 2 years. Towards the end of the 2 years, we will be asking people about how they're going with that. If we need to extend it again for a short period of time, we certainly can do that. There's other things that we can do as well, where we can provide a calculator on our website where you can self-calculate what that rating is going to be, but there will be a sunset on it. So our request is that you start talking to those tenants about that lease requirement now, and talk about how you're going to handle this transition and this phase away from NABERS with green power, and then come and talk to us about how those negotiations are going, and whether it's going to be possible within the 2-year period. But certainly what we heard from stakeholders was actually that 12 months would probably be enough. We made the decision along with the National Steering Committee to extend that to 2 years, just to give that a bit more time. So hopefully within that time, we'll be able to resolve all of those issues. So we're now going to go to the Q&A, which I believe Andy is going to be moderating for us.
Thanks for that, Monique. Yes, we've got quite a few questions that have come through from the channel. So first up, it's a question here. If I want to go through the treatment of on-site renewables in more detail, how can I go about learning? Who should I contact?
So email us at neighbours@environment.newsouthwales.gov.au, and we'll be able to get in touch with you and have a meeting. But we do also have a lot of very detailed information in our rules, which are available on our website. So you've sort of got either of those options. You can go down that pathway of diving into the rules if you're very familiar with the rules, and how our OREG, if you know what that acronym means, then you're definitely in with the rules. But otherwise, if you just like it to be explained in a bit more layman's terms, just email us. I'm more than happy to set up a meeting and talk through your specific situation.
Brilliant. Another question, will the Renewable Energy Indicator include recognition of renewable energy that we generate in our other buildings?
Only if you create LGCs and retire them against the building that is being rated. And that means that you can't use it for the original building. So let's say building A is generating energy, you're able to create LGCs. You can then retire those LGCs against building B. That's no problem. But that means building A can't also use that renewable energy against their claim. So that's how market-based carbon accounting works, is that each unit of renewable energy can only be used once against one carbon account.
I've got another question here. It's just popped through. Do we need evidence and what type of evidence to claim 100% renewable electricity in the ACT?
You don't need any evidence. We have done the work and the hard yards for you. If you go to the estimate your renewable energy indicator calculator, which I showed you earlier, you'll see that if you select ACT, it automatically goes to 100% for you. Very lucky.
Oh, that's good. Another one has just come through. Will it be mandatory to disclose REI or the renewable energy indicator on certificates?
Do you mean, I'm guessing that relates to the commercial building disclosure program. So the requirement to disclose your NABERS energy rating on your billboard will not be changed. So that will still only be the NABERS energy rating. Having said that, from speaking to the Commonwealth team, and I don't want to speak out of line here, I do believe the renewable energy indicator result will be added to the BEAC, so that will be there. Also, if you make your rating public, the renewable energy indicator result will also show up on our website. So I hope that answers your question. You can ask any follow-ups if you want to, but if it's a voluntary rating, just the same as it is now, you can choose to make it private and that information won't come up anywhere. So if you're not covered under any kind of legislation or requirement for mandatory disclosure and you make it voluntary and then you make it private, that information is going to be for you and you only.
There's a question here. Will the renewable energy indicator be recognized by Green Star or GRESB?
That's a fantastic question. So we have been working with those organisations about the different credits that relate to all electric buildings running on 100% renewable energy, and where it makes sense, they have begun to contemplate how the renewable energy indicator will be incorporated. Because it hadn't been launched yet, it's not actually included within those documents yet, as far as I understand. But certainly from a Green Star perspective, those conversations are pretty progressed, and a lot of the information that we are now going to be displaying on the rating report will be able to be used in Green Star.
Amazing. Another one here. How about biogas or green hydrogen? Will the renewable energy indicator recognize those?
At this point in time, no. When we went through the consultation with industry, the decision was made that we would only recognise LGCs. So they are from renewable energy sources. They currently don't include green hydrogen or biogas. There was some discussion that biogas isn't a renewable energy source in the way that we have defined it for the renewable energy indicator. And at the point of time when we were going through the design, there wasn't any green hydrogen that had LGCs associated with it. Having said that, we have said that in the design of the renewable energy indicator, we're going to keep an open mind and we'll go out for consultation again down the line if that's something that industry calls for. Having said that, the view that we have received so far has been relatively strong that that is not something that should be included within the renewable energy indicator. And that's also aligned with what the international bodies have been saying around what buildings should be doing. And again, with reports that have been released by industry, such as Every Building Counts. So what buildings should be looking to do is go all electric and be run on renewable energy that comes from the sun and the wind.
Brilliant. Looking at these questions. How about the Sustainable Portfolio Index? Will we be doing something with that?
We definitely will. So my understanding is that we will be including the renewable energy indicator in the Sustainable Portfolios Index from 2025. But if any of my colleagues want to jump on and correct me on that, happy for you to do so.
Thanks, Fawn. Yeah, so the plan is to include the REI as part of the SPI, but we will have sort of this transition period where, given that the reporting period for the SPI is calendar year, we want to have a full calendar year of ratings certified with the REI, so that all the buildings that have been certified for the SPI do have an REI. So we won't be including the REI on the next edition of the SPI, as you know, we will have some buildings which have been certified with REI and some which wouldn't. So it will be included the following year.
Great. Yes, so 2025.
Thanks, Clemente. A question on carbon neutral certification. Will we be changing the minimum requirements with release of the renewable energy indicator?
At this stage, no, there's going to be no change to climate active carbon neutral certifications or the minimum requirements. Having said that, I know that there is interest from industry in doing that and also interest from Climate Active. So that is something that we're actively looking at. But no, as part of this launch, there isn't going to be any change. The only change will be procedural and administrative. So we're going to try and make it easier for you if you've entered information for your renewable energy indicator, that can also be used across in carbon account for Climate Active carbon neutral, just to provide a bit of streamlining.
Perfect. A little bit of a scenario here. In a 100% electric building where the New South Wales grid hits 50% renewable, am I right in thinking the owner needs to only buy RECs covering 50% of their power to get to 100% renewable?
No, so the way market-based carbon accounting works is you actually have to have a claim to that renewable energy. So even if there's 50% renewables in the grid, you actually only have a claim to 18% of that, between 18 and 20% depending on the year, because those are the renewable energy certificates that the Commonwealth Government has retired on your behalf as part of the renewable energy target. So what you pay for in your electricity bills is essentially that 18 to 20% of renewables. For the remainder of the renewables in the grid, they're actually being allocated and assigned to others that have renewable energy targets. So you can't claim it as well, because that 30% is the bit that's up for grabs. So you do actually need to purchase LGCs and retire them for everything above that minimum renewable energy target, unless you're in the ACT where they're doing it for you. But the underlying increase in renewables in the grid will be looked at in the underlying emissions factors on the NABERS energy side of the ledger. So as renewables in the grid increase, those buildings that are all electric will see an increase in their NABERS star rating, but you won't see any change in the renewable energy indicator score unless you buy those LGCs and allocate them to your account. So you're saying, I have a claim over that particular megawatt of renewable energy, megawatt hour of renewable energy.
Perfect. And I think we've only got time for one more question. Hopefully it's a quick one. Is vertical transport lifts with regeneration considered a renewable source to be included?
It is not, unfortunately. So
Perfect.
it's LGCs, on-site renewable energy generation from solar, and those are the sources that are being considered.
Brilliant. Thanks again, Monique, for your presentation, answering the questions. And I'll now hand you back to Carlos for the panel portion.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Monique, and thank you, Andy. And Monique, thank you for taking us through the renewable energy indicator, what it looks like, how building owners might use it in practice, and but also wanted to thank the broader NABERS community. We didn't work on this alone. We work with hundreds of organizations and professionals in the built environment, from property companies and facility managers to the energy services industry and the energy efficiency sector, NABERS assessors, and all the way to building designers and government policymakers as well. So a big effort as a group to be able to release something that is a nationally harmonized way of disclosing purchases of renewable and electrification. Now, for the second half of this webinar, I wanted to focus on the implications of the renewable energy indicator on the broader property market. And joining me here to talk about that, we have three luminaries of the sustainability world, and I want to invite all of them to turn their cameras on. We have the National ESG Manager for Mirvac, Dave Palin, the National Policy Director for the Property Council, Francesca Muscovich, who is also the Chair of the NABERS Steering Committee, and also the CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, Luke Mansell. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for being here. So, and while I have a couple of questions for you to begin with, but if anyone has questions, feel free to tap them on the chat. We're going to have go through them in about 15 minutes as well, all the questions that you may have together. Dave, I wanted to start with you. We heard from Monique that the renewable energy indicator has been designed to help owners to track their commitments on electrification, on purchases of renewable, on decarbonisation at large. And Mirvac has some of the most ambitious targets when it comes to decarbonizing in Australia, being net positive by 2030. I wanted to ask you, how do you think Mirvac might use a tool like the renewable energy indicator in your journey to decarbonisation?
Thanks, Carlos. It's going to be it's going to play a really important part for us, probably as important as the NABERS tool has played in the efficiency piece. So renewable electricity purchases have really been one of the foundations to achieving our net positive carbon in Scope 1 and Scope 2 in 2021, 9 years ahead of schedule. Then we added in the Scope 3 piece. And when you think about what are the pillars, energy efficiency, so big thank you to NABERS for that piece, renewable energy purchases, so the renewable energy indicator is a really important piece in that. And then there's a small amount of carbon offsets, which will then remove through electrification, again, aiming for 2030. So again, NABERS and the renewable energy indicator plays a really crucial role in all of those key elements within our strategy. We think it makes the measurement and the communication of our goals a lot simpler. It adds clarity. It just makes it more transparent. And selfishly, it adds the weight of NABERS and that trust that NABERS has developed over the last 25 years to what we are saying to the market. We're not just saying, well, look at our energy contracts. Now, here's the certificate. It's backed up. It's a robust system. And I think that's what NABERS really brings to this. I think as well, we see the indicator as an important enabler. We're expecting it to do for renewable energy purchases what NABERS has done for energy efficiency. And you think about where we started, we were lucky if we were 2-star 20 years ago, and now, 5.5, 6 stars. And we're looking really that we think the indicator will do that for the industry. It's also a really key development, and probably one of the most crucial roles is driving electrification within the built environment. And it just makes it much easier to understand the role that renewables are playing and recognizes the part that renewable energy purchases and that role of procurement has played in the space. And finally, I won't waffle on for too long, but finally, we think it's really well timed because there's an urgent need to decarbonize our sector. There's a clear pathway. And once again, this has been recognized in the latest IPCC reports that it really is urgent.
Dave, that's great. I just wanted to recognize that companies like Mirvac are not just leading for themselves, but they're also blazing the trail for a lot of other companies that are a little bit further, a couple of years behind on where your thinking as an organization might be to decarbonize. And the actions that you take really help a lot of others to be able to take them, next year and the year after that. Frankie, I wanted to zoom out because you represent lots of owners like Mirvac across Australia and across multiple different sectors. And a lot of your members have been continuously recognized as world leaders in sustainability in the past decade, not just here in Australia, but globally. And I wanted to ask you, what are property industry, property portfolios and people in the property sector saying about the upcoming renewable energy indicator, and what opportunities do you think it might open for property owners?
Well, I think the sky's the limit, really, if I think about the potential for the impact of the renewable energy indicator. I want to start by saying, I think this reform to NABERS is in the best tradition of the history of this program by bringing a level of transparency, robustness, rigor to the information available to clients and tenants, of buildings across the country. So I think the applications of this are many and varied. I want to pick up on Dave's point about the significance of this happening through NABERS and the potential for public policy to leverage the changes to the NABERS program. If you think about the phasing out of the NABERS rating with green power, what you really do is bringing forward information that's now going to be available with every NABERS energy rating that's made. So any building that's getting a NABERS energy rating, you'll also be able to see how much of their energy is being procured through renewables. And given this is the critical decade, and if you look at the emissions ledger of most buildings, the biggest single-handed chunk of emissions that can be dealt with, right now, is the procurement of renewable electricity to deal with Scope 2 emissions. There is urgency around this. So I think that's sort of imperative number one, if you like. It's really adding to a sense of urgency. I think having it embedded in NABERS ratings sets us up for any number of useful public policy interventions, from the likes of incentives to help with the business case of retrofitting commercial buildings, which we know is not currently, in every case, a cost-effective exercise that needs to be sped along and supported by government. So the fact that, the transparency around that, or the performance of that, can be benchmarked and leveraged through NABERS, only makes the prospect of targeted incentive programs more likely to be effective over time. I also think it's really important that I think when we were talking about the design of this very early on, all those years ago, and I'm really glad Mon took us through the history of this project, because it's been going on for a while, was the importance of also being able to forecast what the impact to your NABERS rating over time would be, so that that's available for projects that are currently in development. And what we've, the position we've taken in Every Building Counts to reflect the research that's been done through ASBEC is that we know electrification is going to be the cheapest, fastest way to decarbonise building operations. So we need to be sending signals to the market right now that every new building should be looking to be designed and delivered as an all-electric one. Because anything that isn't is going to incur costs down the track to be retrofitted. And that's a whole lot of pain we can avoid by smart design now. So the idea of having that ability to, to put in information, you've had a ratings predictor that's been created with this as well, is also a really powerful signal for industry to change. So I think it's there's enormous potential in terms of the impact on the mindset of industry moving forward. This is one of the first really concrete signals to industry that this is the path to take. And your efforts along these lines will be recognised and seen by the market and valued by investors and tenants, because alongside this, as you said, there's advocacy to benchmarks like GRESB and other public policy interventions, as well as what needs to be done for new builds and the retrofit space.
I love that, and your last point on new builds is a great point to continue this conversation, Frankie. We had a stakeholder recently describe the reason why new buildings need to be all electric is because that is stopping the bleeding to begin with and making this problem worse and worse. But then we also need to go and treat the huge patients, which is existing buildings where we don't have the policy levers of the National Construction Code, and we need some additional measures to do with that. So I wanted to pivot to Luke Menzel, and Menno has been leading a lot of conversations about electrification in the past year. Luke, I suspect that's a really big portion of every conversation you had for the past 12 months. You led an Australian building energy efficiency delegation or building sustainability delegation to Germany last year, which was really like a huge dive into electrification. Both Frankie and myself were part of that. And contrary to people that may think that you just talk for a living, the EEC also released not one, but two major reports in the last few months, touching on the point of the importance of electrification policies. One was on heat pumps, harnessing heat pumps for net zero, and the other one very recently was clean energy and clean demand, both which are amazing reads that everyone in this call, if you want to understand this space better, I strongly recommend both of those. I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, why do you think having the renewable energy indicator, in this space, both on your voluntary capacity and also its use in policy, why do you think that's important?
Hey, thanks, Carlos. I enjoyed your analogy of the electrification agenda in the commercial building sector as like a war zone, and we've got the triage tent where the new build is in, and we've just got the people running around with their little foot ambulances around all the rest of the buildings, pulling out gas boilers and putting in heat pumps. Yeah, so you're right. We have done a lot of work in this space. We've been thinking about it for a while. And so, Energy Efficiency Council's been around for almost 15 years. Energy efficiency, as I know it is for NABERS, just good old-fashioned energy efficiency, near and dear to our heart. It's not going away. It's still a huge agenda. And we did recommend that sort of traditional disclosure around NABERS be augmented with the renewable energy indicator, but it was a double-barreled recommendation, which I think is really important to point out. It said expand disclosure of the traditional NABERS rating to a bunch of other different commercial building types, so that we can get that load under control. We can take advantage of the benefits of transparency, energy efficiency as we transition. That's going to be really important. And simultaneously, expand the transparency agenda to include, where you're sourcing your energy from, and is it from a renewable source, which is effectively what this boils down to. Two really important reasons, and they both relate to electrification, actually. First reason is that we're basically rebuilding our entire energy system over the course of 15 or 20 years. So as we know, we're barreling towards 82, 83% renewables by the end of this decade. When I talk to folk that are sort of in the process, either through policy or as part of the industry, about that build out of renewable generation and network infrastructure, it is a huge task. There's a lot of concern about whether we're actually even going to be able to do it. So anything that we can do on the demand side to help our friends on the supply side lessen their load by taking some of the load off the system is going to be helpful. And then the other part of this, of course, is the kind of the obvious bit of the electrification agenda, which is like just providing some transparency, which we've been talking about since 10 a.m. around what is the residual gas use. And that's the power of NABERS, is because as we move to renewables for the electricity load that commercial buildings are already using, like incentivizing and doing what NABERS does so well, which is create a race for the top of who can electrify their existing building stock as quickly as possible, get that residual fossil fuel list as low as possible, as quickly as possible, is incredibly important. But those two things go hand in hand. And I would be incredibly concerned if, you'd gone crazy, Carlos, and you said, who cares about energy efficiency? We're just going to electrify everything and it's going to be great. I know you would not say that. But if you're saying, chuck out the NABERS ratings, let's do the REI, it's all going to be sweet, I'd be saying, fire Carlos. That's a terrible idea. But these two things, they work hand in hand, right? And doing them together it's powerful, and it reflects where we are in the transition, which we need to be thinking about how the supply side and the demand side work together to create wonderful music together. Let's go with that.
Can I just add to that? I think given I think it is worth reflecting for this audience the amount of discussion that was had on this,
Yes.
but not just by the steering committee, but amongst all the stakeholders of NABERS that were involved in the consultation of this. This was a really carefully considered element in terms of how do we respond to the question of the procurement of renewable energy and the greening of the grid over time, and the need to retain the primacy of energy efficiency as a key metric that will endure. And I think that's in some sense, the beauty and the simplicity of how this is shaken out, in that the energy rating is still, the primary thing that's communicated and the focus. Because if you cast your mind forward, and this will be a great problem to have in 10 or 15 years when we're hopefully on a grid that's almost 100% renewable, the relative importance of these things will be reassessed once more. And the focus is not going to be on the big heavy push, which we need to do now to decarbonize the energy supply to our buildings. It will be on, again, continuing to ensure that we have efficient, comfortable places, for people to work and live. So I think I just want to reassure everyone that a lot of thought went into that in terms of how you communicate the performance of buildings over time, and what the implications of doing this now are for the future scenario that we're looking at in 10 to 15 years time.
I think, go on, look.
I was just going to say, which I think was reflected in what Mon was saying in terms of the careful process that we worked through. We ended up in quite a different place to where we thought we were going, but that was because it was considered so carefully. And I actually want to give a shout out to the Energy Efficiency Council members that really, Frankie and I sit on the National Steering Committee. We're obviously representing their voices, but like the deep engagement from EEC members who fed into those processes, part of the commercial building task group that we run, and just really interrogated it and really pushed us and said, what are you trying to achieve here? And I think that really helped me when I turned up to those meetings to say, what is our goal? What are we actually trying to achieve? What is NABERS well placed to do? And what is the gap that we're trying to fill? And that, I think, really sharpened our thinking and led us to landing in a really great spot.
Yeah, thank you both for those comments. And I think just to complement that, I think sometimes creating national frameworks with a lot of feedback from a lot of people takes longer. There's a lot of things that you could do quickly and you can do it in 2-3 months. This didn't take that. It took a couple of years, but it means that we have something that reflects a lot of the, really well articulated thoughts and needs from a lot of people in industry. And once we have it in place, we can actually start focusing on improving buildings now that we dealt very well with the actual metrics. So I want to thank everybody for that. I do have one question I wanted to ask you. Before we go into the open Q&A, so if you are in this session, you have any questions for our panelists, please write it down on the chat in the meantime. But it's and David, I might start with you, but this is for all three of you. We are about to release the renewable energy indicators coming in the next few weeks, and I'm actually really interested about, as David, you as a building owner who has to deal with sites on a side-by-side basis, but also a portfolio. What are you looking to do maybe differently because the renewable energy indicator will be out?
Carlos, can I just, in answering that, could I pick up the point that you just made? I think the indicator is actually a beautiful integration of energy efficiency and renewable energy, and it's those two working together, integrated together. And what I think is really, really clever is the evolution of NABERS without having any drastic changes or any increase in the burden around data. This data already exists, it's readily available, and we should be able to get it and actually put it into the tool quite easily. So I think that's a really clever piece, and hats off to NABERS for actually finding a way to do that. I think in terms of what that changes for us then, in terms of there's no additional burden, it's all benefit, which is really nice. First of all, I think the communication piece is really important. The ability to actually clearly and transparently communicate with trust, because we have the NABERS name behind this, is really important. And that's not just to customers, that's to investors, that's to co-owners, and that's to wider stakeholders within and outside the business. It just makes that so much more clear, adds clarity to that. I think once we go outside that piece, we're excited because there's so many more things that we can be doing with the indicator. I think the green lease space is a really interesting one. We'd love to see something like this brought up into the new government lease, green lease schedule. I think this would be a really nice element to have in there, which then supports electrification and drives electrification in an existing building. So again, just makes it really transparent. You want to look at a building, what are you looking at? Okay, I know that one uses renewables. That's the one I'll go for. It then moves on in terms of maybe green finance could use this. At the moment, the green finance tools, they're still working with NABERS. I think they've really got their head around NABERS and what it does. This could take that to a whole new space in terms of recognizing renewable energy purchases. Love the thoughts around the Sustainable Portfolios Index, just adding to that, both in terms of, okay, well, we've looked at your energy efficient performance, we've looked at your coverage, now we can actually look at your purchasing and what you're doing in purchasing. And then finally, just to finish that point, Carlos, it supports that Australia's 43% carbon reduction target by 2030. We're in an industry which has a clear decarbonisation pathway. We have a moral obligation to do this. And again, it's just adding weight to what we've got to work with to actually achieve that.
I love that, David. Frank and Luke, I'm on the same topic. I wonder, what are the actions that you think we might see from both building owners and also companies working in the energy space, or that we might want to see in the future? What are the practical outcomes that we might want to see in the next couple of years?
I might go. I'm most excited by what I think and hope we'll see in terms of increased demand for renewable energy from tenants. And so I think bringing that extra level of transparency into NABERS ratings, and it won't just be for base buildings, it'll be for tenancy ratings, it'll be for all NABERS energy ratings. Bringing that level of awareness and transparency up front into the rating, I would hope would then foster a lot more discussion between landlords and tenants, and having tenants driving the demand, which hasn't been there to the extent that we would have liked to see over the last few years, for building owners to purchase renewable electricity with or on behalf, of their tenants and seek to retire that. I think because of the work that a lot of at least the leading building owners have done over the last 15, 20 years, have reduced their emissions intensity significantly. Many have already entered into voluntary purchase of renewable electricity, covering most or all of their portfolio. So in that space, some of the leaders have maxed out what they can be doing on their side of the ledger. But on the other half of the building's consumption, responsible, by tenants, there's enormous room to move there. And so I'm hoping this is going to create a whole new market for the procurement of renewable electricity we haven't seen on the client side. And I think, to David's point, that really can and should be driven initially by government tenants in the buildings that they occupy as well.
Yep, very quickly, because that's a great answer. The only other thing I'd say is just encouraging holistic thinking about how these agendas fit together. And that's particularly important as we're hopefully expanding disclosure to new parts of the market. Yes, it's efficiency, but it's also where you're sourcing your energy. It's understanding the different loads in your building, what's being covered by electricity, what's being covered by gas. It provides a really great vehicle for having that conversation. And the third thing, which we'll get to, that isn't quite covered off by the REI, but I know is a topic of active conversation, is, I guess, the time of use, the interaction with the availability of particularly solar on the grid. And that is a whole nother level, which I think is a journey that we're going to be going on. But the REI is a fundamental kind of stepping stone to that broader conversation about how we shape loads to align with a high penetration renewable energy system.
That's great, and it's so great to have such knowledgeable people in this panel who've been thinking about this so hard. And look, you very helpfully put the 2 reports that I've mentioned from the Energy Efficiency Council on the chat. Again, strongly recommended. I did want to talk very briefly about one more report that came, is even more fresh than that. It just came out a couple of weeks, by the Property Council working together with the Green Building Council. And the GBCA is not here in this session, but they are everywhere. We work very closely with them. And Frankie, I wanted to ask you about that. So that report touches on all things decarbonisation, but it's got a focus on electrification, stronger than we've ever seen before. And it's been elevated. And I wanted to ask you both how you think the renewable energy indicator might fit into that electrification advocacy agenda, and also maybe what are some challenges that the Property Council and the GBCA see as barriers that we have to address, in policy and in the market.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Carlos. We're very proud of that policy platform we launched a couple of weeks ago with the Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Jenny McAllister, and our friends at the Green Building Council. We've sought to elevate this agenda because it's one that requires public policy leadership if we're going to get this right. For all the reasons we've already touched on in this panel, it's an enormous transformation, both in mindset and the way we design buildings if we're talking about new building stock coming online. And I think for those who haven't had a look at it, go to everybuildingcounts.com.au. I can post a link in the chat as well. We have things to say about the standards for new buildings. So in that platform, and again, it goes to my previous point that the need to act is now, and the need to pivot the way we think about designing new buildings is right now, not in 10 years' time. So we think commensurate with action taken in other jurisdictions around the world, the next time the building code is upgraded, we should be requiring all new commercial and residential buildings to be all electric. That'll create a level playing field, and it can send, it's a big blunt instrument, but it sends the strongest possible signal to the industry on what needs to happen. Beyond that, and these recommendations are founded in a lot of technical, robust analysis that was done for an ASBEC project. I'd also commend Unlocking the Pathway to you if you haven't seen that report. There's a lot of detailed modelling that went into that. investigate, the various options. We didn't want to presume that electrification was the preferred pathway for buildings without having done that analysis first, despite globally that being the consensus in every credible study that we'd seen. So it was important that we did that work. What it did show to us, though, is that whilst it is the least cost and fastest transition pathway, it's not a no-cost transition. These are not, in the sense of looking across the breadth of the built environment, this is not going to be an easy transition for parts of buildings, and hence why governments need to be all over this from right now. So whilst it's, much more cost effective if you're looking at, say, existing housing to do that retrofit, and I also don't want to undersell the complexities of upgrading very old housing that might need wiring changes and things like that. There's a lot of work that needs to happen there. But from a sort of cost benefit analysis at the outset, it's very cost effective to electrify a home or to build a new home to be all electric. I think the same in 2023, nor on the 11th of May, can't be said for high-rise, large, complex commercial buildings, at least in every instance. But I would hope also that that's going to prompt a lot of, I think, the design profession and our engineers to really reconsider the way that we've designed buildings, and to think not so much about ripping out one big bit of kit in a basement and replacing it with another big bit of kit. If we're looking overseas for inspiration, more decentralized options within buildings, so smaller heat pumps in a basement and booster pumps elsewhere in the building. There are innovative solutions that can be brought to bear here, but there is a role for government to incentivize and smooth that transition if we want that to happen at speed and at scale.
I think that sounds great, Frankie. And I think it's so important, the message that you keep bringing about building codes. And what we've seen from research around the world is that what building zones can do is actually creating markets in ways that is very difficult to do any other way. We have 10 to 20,000 new non-residential buildings built in Australia every year. We have more than 100,000 dwellings or so built every year. And so if building codes require buildings to be all electric, the markets and the expertise on heat pumps and all electric cooking and those kind of technologies just grows very fast. And so it's one of the things that is so important to keep reminding ourselves that that's a lever that Australia will have to take at some point.
Just really quick. Sorry, Frankie. Sorry, just really quickly on that point, Frankie, isn't it? It's incredible. You think there was very few buildings that had an end-of-trip facility 10 years ago. Tenants started asking for them. Lo and behold, 10 years later, almost every building, every premium A, B grade building has an end-of-trip facility, and there's a few $1 million worth of investment in each one of those. If we're getting the requests from the customers, if it's a customer requirement, this will happen very quickly.
Yeah, you're spot on. And so that, the significance of having that indicator there and the ability then for clients who were asking for end of trip facilities not that long ago, and the market responded to that. I want 100% renewable electricity in any building I occupy. Thank you very much. What's the REI for this building? The simplicity with which that can be communicated, and the signal that that's going to give back to the market is what I think we're all most excited about.
And I'm so glad that both of you touched on the relationship between tenants and owners in buildings when we have this tenant owner split, because there was a question about that. There's one more question. This one is not the largest use of fossil fuels on site, but it's a tricky one to address, which is backup generation, often using diesel generators. What do you all see, or what you've been hearing about? What options do we have as a country in the short term, and what do you think that the solution to that might be in the medium term? To whoever wants to take that.
Can I start?
Absolutely.
So essentially what we're looking at is, could we use a biodiesel? Now there are challenges to that, but there's certainly opportunities. I think we got close to this maybe 10, 15 years ago with some more sophisticated type of biofuels. We've gone backwards a little bit, but now I think we're seeing the demand. And I think On-site construction is probably driving some of that demand, so it's really quite exciting. I think we will see that. And then I think when the next time we get the opportunity with PCA upgrades or enhances and updates the guide to office building quality, I think that's where we can actually sit down and review the requirements around backup generation. Do we really need 24 hours of on-site fuel? Do we really need just a couple of hours graceful degradation? Everybody closes the laptop, goes home, which we all did during COVID pandemic. So I think there's things which have changed the environment now in which we work in. The grid is very, very strong in the CBD areas. Do we really need that level of additional gold plating on top of what's happened in the grid? We think there'd be savings, probably a couple of $1 million in the construction side, and it's probably anywhere from 50 to $1 per square meter in savings in not having diesel generators on site.
Yeah, I think Dave's spot on, and I do want to acknowledge the role historically that benchmarks like the Guide to Office Building Quality in the office market have played in encouraging use of that technology. So I hear that feedback a lot. Rest assured that we know about it and we've heard it, and the next time that guide is reviewed, which will be within the next couple of years, that will be addressed. It's a consistent bit of feedback that we've heard, and to Dave's point, circumstances have changed. Those benchmarks need to reflect the reality of the environment we're all operating in. So I guess my message to anyone on this call would be, if that's the thing that's that's stopping you, or perhaps influencing you to take a certain design direction, I would say it shouldn't be for the longer term, because those things are going to be looked at. And if you've got other ways of addressing it, and Dave touched on biofuels in the short term and things like that, I'm definitely hearing that from a lot of members as well.
Look, and I want to go with you with my last question, but that was such a good reminder as well, that the transition to net zero emissions isn't just about technology, it's also about behavior, cultural expectations. And so that was a really, really great answer. Different solution. We just don't have to replace a diesel generator for something that is exactly like that. It's electric. There are other solutions. Luke, so my last question, and I'm going to go to all three of you on this, but I'll start with you, Luke, is what is, if you could get one takeaway that people should take from this session, what do you think that people who are building owners, who are tenants, who are often the end users of a NABERS rating in out there in the world, what do you think they should keep in mind when it comes to the renewable energy indicator and the path to electrification?
So we have an incredible opportunity in Australia because of the ingredients we've got to work with, right? We have, NABERS as an enabling platform, and leaders like you, Carlos, and Mon, and the rest of the team, they're actually always thinking about what's next and what the industry is going to need for the next stage of transition. You've got at the premium end of the market a really sophisticated group of professionals that have been thinking deeply about end use efficiency and loads in buildings and how they can optimize energy use while providing a good outcome for occupants, like people like Dave and many others across the industry, incredibly deep expertise. And we've got a grid that's decarbonising at one of the fastest rates in the world. So Australia has all the ingredients to lead this agenda to show the world how you electrify large existing commercial buildings with plant rooms. Because we've looked around the world. We went to Germany, we looked at what's going on in Europe. And when we were doing the heat pumps report, we took the temperature of experts right around the world, and nobody's really cracked this. There are case studies, there are examples, but nobody's shifted their markets at scale away from that residual gas use. And there's no reason at all why we can't take that leadership position and then export those insights to the world.
I love that. Frankie?
I'll echo everything we just said, obviously. And I think I want to reiterate my interest in for the procurement of renewable energy in buildings more broadly on the client side. I think, as we've sort of said, the top end of the market gets it, but we need action at scale. It's the everything, everywhere, all at once approach. We need to take almost a no regrets approach to the amount of action we take in the next 7 years that we've got till 2030 to do as much as we can. And I think this intervention really sets us up to have kind of conversation we haven't had, I think, between building owners and tenants. And I particularly look forward to the role that the public sector in government through their procurement can play to really put a rocket ship under this, because historically they have played that role through their procurement targets with NABERS energy ratings. And there's no reason they can't and shouldn't play that leadership role again.
Love that. David, last thoughts.
I think that's a really good point. I think maybe go back to one of the points we raised earlier. We see the renewable energy indicator having the same impact on renewables that NABERS had on energy efficiency. We would love to see that come through, just in terms of now we've got this beautiful integration of energy efficiency and renewables. There's no reason to not buy renewables right now. Now you're actually recognised for those purchases. It is a procurement issue. There'll be other procurement issues, but then it does put us on that electrification pathway. So we are incredibly privileged in Australia. We have no excuses. We have NABERS, we have Green Star, we have the PCA, we have the Energy Efficiency Council. We're remarkably privileged. We can definitely do this.
I love that. So we have all the ingredients to be able to do this. We need action, everything everywhere all at once. And we're hoping that the renewable indicator can be a catalyst to be able to drive a lot of purchase of renewables in the immediate term, and also facilitate more action on electrification in the coming years. I want to thank David, Luke, and Frankie for all your time, thoughts in this space. You've been leaders in this space for a long time. We've learned a lot from your leadership and your members and colleagues. And I wanted to, just as a last thought before we end today, today's session was all about sharing the work that many of you have been participating in, and letting you know that this is going to go out in the next month. The 6th of June is the current release time. We're going to continue to do a series of webinars like this ones aimed at our customers and building owners, tenants, and end users of NABERS ratings, in addition to a lot of the webinars that we already do with a lot of the energy services industry and circular economy industries and NABERS assessors as well. So we'll continue to do that. The next one will be in a few months. And if you're interested in that, feel free to reach out to us and our team on that. And that's it. I just want to thank you all for being here. We are a program that is here to serve the building sustainability industry, and we're doing everything we can to help Australia decarbonize, and so are you. And I do think that today is a good indication that when we work together, we can achieve things that are much, much harder for all of us to achieve in isolation. So thank you for all your time, effort, support throughout these 2 years, and we look forward to working with you to have buildings that are efficient and run on 100% renewable energy. Thank you.